A cemetery in southern England holds 57 bodies, and 2 out of every 3 of them share the same mother, not the same tribe, not the same village, the same maternal bloodline, stretching back further than anyone expected a Celtic community to remember its own women. Somewhere nearby, the men buried in that same ground carry almost no genetic relation to each other at all, as if they arrived from somewhere else, one by one, generation after generation. And the story we have told for 2,000 years about who ran Celtic Britain, about the robed druid standing over a crowd, staff raised, secrets guarded, is not the story the bones are telling. Something moved through this island long before Rome ever set foot on it, and it left a signature in the DNA that nobody was looking for. What if the Druids, the wise men, the supposed rulers of Iron Age Britain, were never actually the ones holding the society together at all? This is not folklore dressed up as science. The findings come from Trinity College Dublin, where geneticist Laura Casti led the ancient DNA analysis, working alongside archaeologist Miles Russell at Bournemouth University, whose team had spent years excavating the site itself. Their work was published in the journal Nature, subject to the same peer review as any other major genomic study, and it sits inside a much larger decade-long effort to sequence the genomes of Iron Age Britain using tools that did not exist even 15 years ago. Whole genome sequencing, isotope analysis of tooth enamel, radiocarbon dating refined to within a few decades. This is not guesswork dressed in a lab coat. It is measurable, repeatable, and it keeps confirming itself across site after site. None of this happened overnight either. It is the product of a wider archaeogenetics movement that has spent the last decade rewriting large stretches of European prehistory, the same broad field that identified population replacement in Neolithic Britain, traced dynastic elites buried inside Neolithic monuments, and mapped the arrival of new ancestry across the continent thousands of years before anyone spoke a Celtic language at all. The Dorset findings did not appear in isolation. They landed inside a research pipeline that had already proven again and again that ancient DNA can catch things textbooks missed, simply because bones do not care what story people prefer to believe. Before we get to what the DNA actually revealed, it is worth walking through what most people already believe about the Celts, because every one of those beliefs feels reasonable, and every one of them is now under serious pressure. The first belief is the oldest and the most cinematic, that Druids were a ruling class, a kind of priesthood meets government that held political power over Celtic tribes, deciding laws, leading rituals, commanding respect from kings. It is a beautiful image, partly because it comes from real ancient sources. Julius Caesar wrote about Druids in Gaul, describing them as judges, teachers, and religious authorities. The idea took deep root, and by the time it reached Romantic-era paintings and 20th century fiction, the Druid had become the central authority figure of an entire pre-Roman world. But here is the problem. Nowhere in the genetic record is there evidence of a distinct, biologically separate ruling caste passing power through bloodlines the way, say, Egyptian or Inca elites sometimes did. What the DNA in Dorset actually shows is almost the opposite of a top-down priesthood, a community organized around female kinship, where women stayed rooted in one place for centuries and men were the ones who moved in from outside. That is not the structure of a Druid-led hierarchy. That is something closer to a decentralized, women-anchored social network, which is a very different kind of power altogether. The second belief is about origins. Most people assume the Celts swept into Britain as a single, coherent wave of invaders sometime in the Iron Age, bringing their language, their art, their religion, and their druids all at once, replacing whoever was there before. This is sometimes called the Celtic from the East hypothesis, and it has textbook staying power because it is simple and dramatic. But a landmark study led by researchers at the University of York and the University of Vienna, expanding the amount of ancient DNA available from Bronze and Iron Age Britain by more than tenfold, found something the simple invasion story cannot explain. There was no large-scale population turnover during the Iron Age at all. The genetic ancestry connected to Celtic language and culture was already arriving centuries earlier, during the Late Bronze Age, in smaller, steadier movements from the near continent, particularly from what is now France. Professor Ron Pinhasi, one of the study's senior authors, pointed out that this dramatically increases the likelihood of what researchers now call Celtic from the center, rather than the older Eastern invasion model. In other words, the Celts were not conquerors sweeping in with their druids fully formed. They were the product of a much slower blending, absorbed into the existing population rather than replacing it. The third belief is the most emotionally satisfying and, in a strange way, the most wrong, that the Celts and their druidic culture along with them were essentially wiped out. First by Rome, which famously targeted Druids directly, and later by Anglo-Saxon migration, which supposedly buried what was left of native British identity under a new Germanic population. It makes for a tidy narrative of erasure, But a major genomic survey, led by Marina Silva at the Francis Crick Institute in London, analyzing more than 1,000 ancient genomes spanning the first millennium AD, found that the Roman period left surprisingly little genetic mark on the wider population of Britain at all. Roughly 80% of individuals living in Britain during Roman times cluster almost exactly with the Iron Age population that came before them. Continuity, not replacement. The disruption everyone assumes happened under Rome barely registers in the DNA. It was later, during the Anglo-Saxon period, that the genetic landscape shifted more significantly, and even then, in a patchwork rather than a total wipeout. None of these three popular stories, the ruling priesthood, the sudden invading wave, or the total erasure, survive contact with the genome. But none of them get us to the real answer yet either. They just clear the ground. To understand what the DNA is actually doing, it helps to think about it the way you'd think about a family surname, except instead of passing through fathers the way most surnames do, imagine it passing only through mothers, silently, invisibly, for thousands of years. That is roughly how mitochondrial DNA works. It sits outside the nucleus of the cell, inside tiny energy-producing structures called mitochondria, and it is inherited almost exclusively from the mother, unchanged generation after generation, except for the occasional small mutation. Track that unbroken maternal thread across dozens of skeletons in the same cemetery, and you are essentially reading a genealogical ledger that nobody wrote down on purpose. Alongside that, researchers use isotope analysis on a tooth enamel, which works almost like a geographic fingerprint locked into your body during childhood. The water and food you consumed as a child leaves a chemical signature tied to the local geology of wherever you grew up. And that signature stays fixed in your teeth for life, even if you move somewhere else entirely as an adult. Put those two tools together, maternal DNA lineage and childhood geographic signature, and you can reconstruct not just who someone was related to, but where they were born and where they ended up dying, without a single written record. Here is where it gets specific. The cemetery is in Winterbourne, Kingston, Dorset, in southwest England, associated with a tribal group known as the Druids, and it was in continuous use from roughly 100 years before the Common Era to around 200 years after it, spanning the very period when Rome invaded and settled into Britain. 57 individuals were analyzed. 2/3 of them descended from a single maternal lineage. 2/3. That is not a scattering of distant cousins. That is a large extended family rooted to one place, tracing itself back through the mothers for generation after generation, while the wider political world around them changed completely. Laura Cassidy called the finding jaw-dropping, noting it had never been observed before anywhere in European prehistory at this scale. Meanwhile, the men buried alongside these women showed far weaker genetic connections to one another, consistent with a pattern researchers call matrilocality, where husbands moved to join their wives' communities rather than the reverse. If you grew up assuming Iron Age Britain worked the way Rome or later medieval Europe did, with land and lineage passing through fathers, this flips the entire assumption on its head. And this is the part where a lot of people expect the discovery to stop. One striking cemetery, one interesting local anomaly. It doesn't. This is where the second team comes in. And this is the moment the finding stops being a local curiosity and becomes something bigger. Because the Dorset result was not isolated. When the same researchers widened the lens and compared genetic data from other Iron Age burial sites across Britain, the same female-centered pattern kept surfacing again and again in different regions, different tribal groups, different centuries. That kind of independent repetition is what scientists call triangulation, and it matters enormously. One remarkable cemetery could be an outlier, a strange local exception. The same pattern showing up across a wider swath of Iron Age Britain is something closer to a structural feature of the culture itself. Now, here's the part that connects everything we walked through earlier. Roman writers, including Caesar himself, complained with obvious discomfort about how independent Celtic women in Britain seemed to be. Archaeologists had already noticed that high-status grave goods, jewelry, mirrors, prestige items were frequently buried with women rather than men. What the genetics now confirms is that this wasn't just symbolic respect. It reflects an actual social architecture where land, community, and continuity were organized around female to relocate, marry in, and integrate. Bournemouth University's Miles Russell put it plainly, this made Celtic society in Britain more egalitarian than the Roman world it was about to collide with. That single sentence should stop you for a second, because it means one of the most militarily dominant empires in human history was, in this specific respect, socially less balanced than the barbarian tribes it was conquering. If you're wondering where the Druids actually fit into all of this, you're asking exactly the right question, because this is the part that reframes everything. The Druid of popular imagination is almost always male, almost always singular. almost always positioned as an authority figure standing above the community rather than woven inside it. But there is no genetic signature anywhere in the Iron Age British record for a distinct priestly bloodline. No isolated lineage of special Druid families passing ritual authority down he later would. What the DNA shows instead is a society whose real continuity, whose actual social memory, was carried by women staying rooted in place across centuries, while religious or ceremonial roles, whatever they looked like locally, existed inside that same interwoven, female-anchored community rather than above it. That distinction matters more than it first appears. A ruling priesthood implies a hierarchy sitting outside the normal machinery of a community, granted authority almost independently of family or land. A female-anchored kinship network implies the opposite, that whatever spiritual or ceremonial roles existed were embedded inside the same households and bloodlines that held the land itself, inherited alongside everything else a mother passed down, not bestowed from above by a separate caste. In the next part of this, we go straight into what that means for the bigger, older question of where Celtic identity in Britain came from in the first place, because the origin story matters just as much as the social structure. Go back to that Bronze Age migration data for a second, because it reshapes the picture even further. If Celtic-associated ancestry was arriving gradually from the near continent centuries before the Iron Age, blending into an existing population rather than sweeping it aside, then the entire idea of the Celts, as a separate people who conquered Britain and imposed a druidic ruling class on the locals, starts to fall apart at the foundation. There was no external ruling group parachuting in to install a priesthood on top of a passive native population. The population was already there, already evolving its own social and religious structures, and it absorbed new arrivals steadily over generations, rather than being overwritten by them. The Celtic from the center model, as Professor Pinhazy framed it, means Celtic language and culture likely spread through networks of contact, trade, and small-scale migration radiating outward from a continental core, not through a single dramatic Iron Age invasion carrying druids and warriors across the Channel all at once. There's also a question worth sitting with here because it changes how we should picture the actual moment Celtic identity took shape in Britain. If the shift happened, whatever social structures were already in place, including the kind of female-anchored kinship network later visible at Dorset, had centuries longer to develop and settle before anyone in Rome ever wrote a word about Druids at all. The researchers behind the York and Vienna study also noted something else worth pausing on. Alongside the Bronze Age genetic shift, they found a sharp rise in the frequency of the gene variant for lactase persistence, the ability to digest milk into adulthood among the incoming population compared to their continental relatives. That is not a minor detail. It suggests these newcomers were not conquerors arriving with swords first. They were farmers, herders, people whose survival depended on dairy, slowly folding into an existing landscape, rather than burning through it. Put that beside the isotope evidence from sites like Cliff's End Farm in Kent, where some individuals were shown to have spent their childhoods across the Channel before ending up buried in Britain, and you start to see a picture built from small, repeated movements of ordinary people rather than one legendary invasion. That reframes the second half of the story too, the part about Rome. If 80% of the population living in Britain during Roman times traces directly back to the Iron Age population before it, as Marina Silva's Crick Institute analysis found, then the supposed destruction of Druidic Celtic culture by Rome looks far less like an extermination and far more like a political and religious suppression layered on top of a population that, genetically, simply kept going. Rome banned Druidic practice, attacked its sacred groves, executed its practitioners in places like Anglesey, according to Roman historical accounts. That much appears to be real and well documented. But banning a religious practice and erasing a population's bloodline are two completely different things, and the genome only supports the first one. The people did not vanish. Their social structure, particularly the female-centered, kinship networks visible in places like Dorset, appears to have persisted well into the Roman period itself, hiding in plain sight underneath a new political order. If you've been enjoying how these three separate lines of evidence, the Dorset Cemetery, the Bronze Age migration data, and the Roman-era continuity study, keep locking into the same unexpected picture, this is usually the point where people hit subscribe, because the next section of the video only gets stranger from here. Before going any further, it's worth being completely honest about what this evidence does not show, because overselling a real discovery is how good science turns into bad mythology all over again. Nobody has identified the DNA of an actual named Druid. There is no skeleton anywhere in the archaeological record labeled with certainty as a Druid, an Archdruid, or a ritual specialist of any kind, because ancient sources rarely, if ever, marked graves that way, and Roman writers who described Druids were often working from second-hand accounts filtered through cultural bias. What we have is population-level evidence, patterns across dozens of skeletons in specific cemeteries, patterns across broader regional surveys, and patterns across centuries of migration data. That is powerful evidence for how Celtic society in Britain was generally organized, but it is not the same as individually testing a specific historical figure and confirming their lineage or their exact social role. To be clear, nobody involved in this research is claiming to have sequenced Boudica's genome or identified the bones of a specific named druid mentioned in any surviving text. That kind of individual level confirmation simply does not exist for this period, and any version of this story that implies otherwise is going further than the evidence allows. Matrilocality, women staying rooted in place while men moved in, is also not automatically the same thing as matriarchy, formal female political rule. The researchers themselves are careful about this distinction. Strong female kinship networks and control over land or social continuity do not necessarily mean women held formal titles of governance the way a queen or a chieftain might have. It is entirely possible, even likely, that Celtic Britain combined this female-anchored domestic and social structure with forms of religious or military leadership, open to men, women, or both, depending on region and period, and the current genetic evidence simply cannot resolve that question on its own. Isotope and DNA analysis can tell you who someone was related to and roughly where they grew up. It cannot tell you what title they held, what rituals they performed, or whether their community called them a druid at all. The honest version of this discovery is narrower and, frankly, more interesting than the version that would go viral for the wrong reasons. Not women secretly ruled the druids, but the social fabric holding these communities together for centuries ran through women, in a culture whose religious and political authority structures we still only partially understand. It's worth sitting with that limitation for a moment, because it is exactly what makes the field trustworthy. Ancient DNA research does not claim to solve every mystery it touches. It claims to test specific, falsifiable questions against physical evidence, and then it reports honestly, when the evidence only takes you part way. That restraint is not a weakness in the story. It's the reason the story is worth believing in the first place. And there is still real space for future work here. The same techniques being used in Dorset are now being extended across dozens more Iron Age sites throughout Britain and continental Europe, through ongoing programs like the Comios Project, examining Iron Age Britons and their continental neighbors, and newer efforts specifically targeting the wider Celtic-speaking world from France to Slovakia. Every new cemetery sequenced is another chance to either confirm this female-centered pattern at scale or discover that Dorset was more unusual than it currently appears. Science does not close this book. It keeps turning pages, and each page so far has agreed with the last one in a way that should make you sit up. So picture that cemetery again, the one we opened with. 57 graves, 2/3 of them tracing back to a single mother's line, stretching across roughly 300 years, through peace, through invasion, through the collapse of an entire political world around them. No robed figure standing above that community with a staff raised, commanding obedience, matches what the bones actually describe. What matches, instead, is quieter and, in its own way, far more remarkable. Women who stayed, who anchored an entire community's memory and identity in place, generation after generation, while empires rose and fell around them and men came and went. The Druids, we grew up imagining, were never disproven so much as displaced, pushed out of the center of the story to make room for something the ancient sources barely mentioned and the genome could not stop confirming. Think about how strange that actually is. 2,000 years of Roman commentary, Romantic-era paintings, and modern fiction all centered the same lone male figure at the heart of Celtic religious life, and it took a handful of overlooked skeletons in a Dorset field to point out that the real backbone of that society was never him. It was the women who never left. Every written account we inherited about the Druids came filtered through people who conquered them, feared them, or romanticized them centuries after the fact, and none of those accounts had access to a single strand of DNA. The bones did not have an agenda. They simply stayed exactly where they were buried, waiting for a technology capable of finally listening to them properly. Maybe that's the real shift here. Not that the old story was a lie, but that it was incomplete, built entirely on the voices Rome chose to write down, while the actual continuity of these communities was carried by the people nobody bothered to name. Tell me in the comments which part of this hit you harder. The 2/3 maternal lineage in that one Dorset cemetery, or the fact that Rome's conquest barely shows up in the DNA at all.